Hi everyone, welcome back to MZHD News. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so you stay informed on the stories that matter most across Southern Africa. Today, we're unpacking a developing and highly sensitive issue coming out of Zimbabwe, a debate that strikes at the very heart of democracy, public participation, and constitutional governance. Attorney General Virginia Mabhiza has come under increasing scrutiny after firmly dismissing calls for a national referendum on proposed constitutional changes. Her remarks, delivered in an interview with state media, have triggered a wave of criticism from legal experts, civil society groups, and ordinary citizens who believe the matter goes far beyond legal technicalities. At the center of this debate is a fundamental question: should constitutional amendments, which shape the future of a nation, be decided solely by Parliament, or should the people have the final say through a referendum? Mabhiza's position is clear and unapologetic. She argues that calls for a referendum are not grounded in law, but rather driven by political motives. According to her interpretation, Zimbabwe's constitution already provides a precise and deliberate framework for when a referendum is required, and this current amendment, she insists, does not meet that threshold. To understand her argument, we need to look at Section 3286 of the Constitution. This provision specifically outlines that a referendum is only mandatory in three narrowly defined situations: when amendments affect Chapter 4, which deals with the Declaration of Rights, Chapter 16, which concerns agricultural land, or Section 328 itself, which governs how the Constitution can be amended. Outside of these areas, Mabhiza maintains that the process is straightforward. Once a constitutional amendment secures a two-thirds majority in both houses of Parliament, it can be forwarded to the President for assent without going back to the people. From a strictly legal standpoint, this interpretation appears consistent with the letter of the law, but critics argue that democracy is not just about legality, it's also about legitimacy. And that's where the controversy deepens. Opponents of Mabhiza's stance say her argument risks reducing a living, breathing constitution into a rigid technical document detached from the people it is meant to serve. They argue that constitutional changes, even if they don't fall within the three protected categories, can still have far-reaching consequences that justify broader public consultation. In their view, relying solely on parliamentary numbers, even a two-thirds majority, may not adequately reflect the will of the people, especially in a political environment where trust in institutions is already under strain. This concern is particularly significant in Zimbabwe's current context, where many citizens and civic organizations have repeatedly called for greater transparency, accountability, and inclusion in national decision-making processes. Critics also take issue with Mabhiza's characterization of referendum demands as politically motivated. They argue that such language risks delegitimizing genuine public concerns and discouraging civic engagement. In a democracy, they say, questioning government processes should not be dismissed as politics, it should be welcomed as participation. Mabhiza, however, remains firm. She emphasizes that the constitutional provisions are not optional and should not be treated as a loophole to be exploited. In her words, insisting on a referendum in this situation is not only legally unfounded, but unconstitutional. But that strong stance has done little to quiet the debate. Instead, it has amplified calls from observers who believe the government is focusing too heavily on procedural correctness while overlooking the broader principles of democratic inclusivity. Adding another layer to the discussion is the intervention of Justice, Legal, and Parliamentary Affairs Minister Ziyambi, who has echoed Mabhiza's position. Ziyambi pointed to the origins of the current constitution, which was adopted in 2013 following a national referendum. According to him, the people themselves set the rules during that process, clearly outlining when future referendums would be required. His argument is that Zimbabweans effectively agreed that not every amendment would need to go back to a public vote. Instead, they entrusted Parliament with the authority to make changes, provided the strict two-thirds majority requirement is met. From this perspective, the government is simply following the framework that was approved by the people themselves. However, critics are not convinced. They argue that invoking the 2013 Constitution without considering today's political realities ignores a crucial factor: context. Over a decade has passed since that referendum, and the political landscape has evolved significantly. Trust in public institutions, according to many observers, is more fragile than it was in 2013. In such an environment, even legally sound processes can face legitimacy challenges if they are perceived as excluding the public. This brings us to a broader and more philosophical issue. What does democracy truly mean in practice? Is it enough for leaders to follow the law to the letter, or should they also actively seek to engage citizens, especially on issues as fundamental as constitutional reform? For many Zimbabweans, this is not just a legal debate, it's a question of ownership. The Constitution is often described as the supreme law of the land, but it is also seen as a social contract between the state and its people. When that contract is amended, critics argue that the people should not feel like passive observers. Instead, they should feel like active participants in shaping the rules that govern their lives. On the other hand, supporters of the government's position warn against turning every constitutional amendment into a referendum. They argue that such an approach could slow down governance, create unnecessary political tension, and make it difficult to implement necessary reforms. They also point out that Parliament itself is an elected body representing the will of the people. If a supermajority of lawmakers supports an amendment, they argue, that decision carries democratic weight. So what we are seeing here is a classic tension between two interpretations of democracy: representative democracy, where elected officials make decisions on behalf of the people, and participatory democracy, where citizens are directly involved in key decisions. As this debate continues, one thing is clear: the issue is far from settled. Public discourse around constitutional reform is intensifying, and the positions taken by figures like Virginia Mabhiza and Ziyambi are likely to remain under close scrutiny. For now, the government appears determined to proceed within the existing legal framework without a referendum. But the growing calls for broader consultation suggest that this approach may come at a political cost. If citizens feel excluded from the process, it could deepen mistrust and fuel further debate, not just about this amendment, but about governance and accountability more broadly. And that's why this story matters, not just for Zimbabwe, but for the entire region. It highlights the delicate balance between law and public trust, between authority and accountability, and process and participation. As always, we'll continue